On September 3rd, 1992, Martin Hale was 59 years old when his Ford TW-35 froze halfway through a dryland wheat field outside Scottsbluff, Nebraska. The engine was still running. The hydraulics still answered. The PTO would spin, but the transmission would not take a gear. And a tractor that can do everything except move is just a very loud kind of useless. Martin sat there for nearly half an hour, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the shifter, waiting for the machine to tell him something different. It never did. So he shut it down, climbed out, and started walking back toward the county road under a hard western Nebraska sun that flattened the whole afternoon into white glare. By the time he reached the pickup at the section line, his shirt was dark with sweat, and his mind had already started doing the math. Rain was due in 2 days. The wheat stubble still needed to be worked. Fuel was already paid for. Labor was already lined up. And the one machine he trusted most was stranded in the field like a broken promise. His wife June knew before he said a word that something had gone wrong. He came through the kitchen door, set his cap on the table, and just stood there. "What stopped?" she asked. "The Ford," Martin said. That got her attention. Not because machines never failed, they did. But that tractor usually didn't. Martin had bought the TW-35 in 1984 with no trade, no financing, and no help from anybody but his own discipline. $28,000. One check, after years of patching along older equipment, rebuilding starters himself, pressing bearings in a drafty shed, and taking every custom hay job he could get just to save cash. It was not the biggest tractor in the county, not the newest, not the kind people stopped to admire. It was simply the one he owned free and clear. For 8 years it had done exactly what a man in Martin's position needed a machine to do. It pulled the disc in spring, handled grain wagons in fall, ran the mower conditioner in June and the auger in November. It started in cold weather, didn't smoke, didn't drink oil, didn't ask for excuses. It just worked. Now it was sitting dead still in a field at the worst possible time. The next morning, Martin called Panhandle Farm Supply, the Ford New Holland dealership in town. The place was run by Glenn Mercer, a man Martin had known since the late 60s. Glenn had sold him parts, filters, belts, and eventually the tractor itself. Martin had recommended that dealership to neighbors. He had sent business their way. Over the years, he had come to think of the place the way farmers used to think of local dealers when those places still ran on memory and names instead of quarterly logic. The service desk picked up. Martin explained the symptoms carefully. The man on the line listened, then said they could maybe send somebody out next week. Martin said next week would not work. The man said they were overloaded. Martin asked if they could at least inspect it by Friday. There was a pause on the line, and then the voice changed, in a way Martin would remember for the rest of his life. "We really don't do much with that series anymore," the man said. Martin asked him what that meant. "It means support on those older Ford units is limited. If it's transmission, we're probably not the shop for it." Martin thought he had misheard him. He asked again, slower this time. The answer did not improve. "We can come look if you want," the man said. "But I'm telling you now, if it needs a major rebuild, you'll be better off replacing it." Martin stayed quiet long enough that the man filled the silence himself. Those older tractors just aren't where the business is anymore. That sentence did more damage than the breakdown, because the tractor failing was mechanical. This was something else. Martin thanked him, hung up, and sat at the kitchen table without moving. June watched him from the sink. What did they say? He looked at the wall before he answered. They said it's old, he told her, and that seems to matter more than whether it can be fixed. That was the moment the story actually began. Martin Hale had farmed the same ground his father rented before finally buying it in 1951, one quarter section first, then another when a neighbor retired, and then 60 more acres of rougher land nobody wanted because it blew dry every August. He kept it anyway. He was the middle child of 4. 2 sisters moved to Cheyenne. His older brother took a railroad job and never came back. Martin stayed because he liked work that answered to weather instead of supervisors. He liked the sternness of it, the sequence, the fact that what you failed to do in April would come looking for you in September. His father had taught him a rule that sounded old-fashioned even then. Replace the broken part, not the whole machine. If a hose failed, you changed the hose. If a gear chipped, you pulled the housing and fixed the gear. You did not surrender something useful just because the calendar said it had been around a while. That was how poor farmers survived. They did not win by upgrading faster. They won by stretching value farther than other people had the patience to see. Martin's first tractor had been a used Minneapolis Moline that leaked more than it ran. He bought it in 1968 for $1,800 and kept it alive with salvage yard parts and stubbornness. One winter he rebuilt the steering box on a bench made from 2 sawhorses and an old door. Another year he welded a cracked drawbar himself because the repair quote was higher than the machine felt worth. He was not sentimental about equipment. He was disciplined about utility. If a machine could still earn its keep, it deserved the chance. That was what the TW-35 represented to him. Not nostalgia, proof. It was supposed to be the tractor that carried him into the last serious stretch of his working life. He planned to farm until around 70, then lease some ground, keep a smaller operation, and use the Ford for lighter jobs around the place. It was already paid for. It was already known. It had already proven itself. And now the dealership that had sold it to him was talking about it like spoiled inventory. 3 days later, a service truck finally came out. The mechanic was young, maybe 30, someone Martin did not recognize. He checked pressure, crawled under the rear housing, tried the linkage, drained a little fluid into a pan, and spent 20 minutes moving around the tractor with the brisk confidence of someone who already suspected the answer. When he stood up, he wiped his hands and gave Martin the verdict. "Transmission section's bound up," he said. "You're looking at a teardown." Martin asked whether Panhandle could do it. The mechanic shifted his weight before answering. "Not likely. We don't stock what it'd take, and I doubt the shop wants to tie up a bay on something this old." Martin asked what a used transmission assembly would cost. "If you found one, maybe $3,000, maybe more. Labor puts you north of $6,000. "And if I can't find one?" The mechanic gave a thin little shrug. "Honestly, you'd probably do better to part it out and move into something newer." Move into something newer. That was the language people used when the money in the sentence was not theirs. The truck left in a cloud of dust, and Martin stood beside the tractor until the field got quiet again. That night he went through the file cabinet in the small room off the kitchen where he kept tax papers, manuals, receipts, and maintenance logs. He pulled out the original sales invoice from 1984. He found every filter date he had written down, every oil interval, every note in the margin of the owner's manual about grease points and torque specs. The pages had that soft look paper gets when it has been touched by the same hands for years. He had done his part. That mattered to him more than he could have explained to someone outside that world. The next morning he began calling other dealers. North Platte, no parts. Sterling, Colorado, no commitment. A place outside McCook said they might know a salvage yard in Kansas, but it would take time, and there were no guarantees. Then, near the end of the afternoon, Martin called a dealership outside Salina, Kansas, almost 300 miles away. The man who answered introduced himself as Ray Dolan. Martin explained the tractor, the symptoms, the year, and the serial number. Ray listened without interrupting. When Martin finished, Ray asked him to hold. 2 minutes later, he came back. I've got a transmission center section from a TW30 that should cross over, Ray said. Came out of a municipal unit with low hours. We went through it last winter. If your housings are clean, I can make that work. Martin did not answer right away. He had spent the last day hearing versions of no. Ray sounded like a man standing in front of the part while he spoke. You sure? Martin asked. Sure enough to tell you not to scrap that tractor, Ray said. Bring it here, and if what you told me is accurate, I think I can get you moving. That was the first hopeful sentence Martin had heard since the breakdown. The problem was distance. Scottsbluff to central Kansas was not a casual trip with dead equipment behind you. It meant finding a trailer, finding a truck heavy enough to pull it, mapping fuel stops, watching weather, and betting that the shop on the other end would be as serious in person as the man on the phone sounded. June asked him that night whether this was too much trouble for an aging tractor. Martin gave her the only honest answer he had. It might be, he said, but I'd rather know I tried than spend the next 10 years wondering whether I gave it up because somebody closer wanted me to. By Thursday afternoon, he had borrowed a detached trailer from a neighbor who hauled dozers, and he had talked his friend Dale Wimmer into making the trip with his 1-ton diesel. The route would take them southeast across Nebraska, then down through north-central Kansas, just under 600 miles round trip each way once the detours and fuel stops were counted. They decided to leave before dawn on Saturday. Loading the Ford was its own kind of humiliation. A tractor that had once carried whole seasons now had to be winched slowly onto steel by another man's truck. Martin checked chains twice. Then he checked them again. Dale asked if he really believed this would work. Martin looked back through the mirror at the machine behind them and said, I believe the man in Kansas talked like the tractor still mattered. That's enough to get me there. They left at 4:40 in the morning. The drive was long and unspectacular in the way serious drives usually are. Grain elevators came and went. The radio faded in and out. They stopped for coffee in Holdridge, diesel near Phillipsburg, and lunch at a small diner where Dale finally said what several people had already implied. This is a lot of road for one old Ford. Martin nodded. Yes, he said, and it's less road than starting over on a new payment schedule. They reached Dolan Equipment just after 2:30. The dealership sat on the edge of town behind a row of wind-stunted cottonwoods, not flashy, not large, but alive in the way competent places often are. Pickups were parked crooked. A service door was open. You could hear air tools inside. Ray Dolan met them in the yard. He was older than Martin expected, broad through the shoulders, with oil-darkened fingernails and a cap so sweat-stained it looked permanent. He walked around the Ford once, put a hand on the fender, and looked at Martin with something close to approval. "Clean tractor," he said. "You didn't neglect this one." It was the exact opposite of how the problem had been framed back home. Inside the service bay, Ray's lead mechanic, Vince Herrera, had the used assembly already set on a pallet. It was not junk dragged out from weeds. It was cleaned, sealed, and tagged. Vince explained what had been inspected, what still needed checking, and what he wanted to confirm once the rear was open. He spoke about the repair as if it were work worth doing, not a favor for a man too stubborn to move on. Ray told Martin they could probably have it done by Tuesday afternoon. Martin asked if he should stay in town. Ray shook his head. "No reason to waste motel money," he said. "We'll call you. I'll tell you straight. But if the housings are decent, this tractor's leaving here under its own power." Martin believed him. That mattered almost as much as the repair itself. The trailer rode home empty. It should have felt like a relief, but empty trailers can make a man think too much. Dale asked whether Martin would ever use Panhandle again if the Kansas repair worked. Martin kept watching the road. "I don't know," he said. But what he meant was this: some things do not feel broken until they do, and once they break, there is no useful way to pretend you did not hear the sound. Tuesday came and went slowly. At 11:17 that morning, the phone rang. June answered, then held the receiver out to Martin with a look on her face he had not seen since before the breakdown. It was Ray. "Your Ford's ready," he said. "Shifted it through every range. Pulls clean. We changed the seals we could reach while we were in there. Come get your tractor." Martin and Dale left again before daylight the next morning. When they arrived, the TW-35 was idling outside the shop, angled toward the yard like it was impatient to leave. Vince waved Martin over and told him to take his time. Martin climbed into the cab, pushed the clutch, eased the shifter forward, and felt the tractor move with the smooth, mechanical certainty he had been afraid he might never feel again. No grind, no hesitation, no ugly protest buried in the housing. Just motion. He drove one lap around the lot, then another. By the time he climbed down, relief had done what anger had not. It had made him quiet. The invoice came to $4,380. $2,400 for the assembly, $1,700 for labor, the rest seals, fluids, gaskets, and shop supplies. Ray walked him through each line. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was padded. Martin wrote the check on the counter. Ray handed him the carbon copy and said, "If you ever need help with it again, call me first. I don't care that you're in Nebraska." That line sealed the story. Not because it was dramatic, because Martin believed him. The tractor came home the next day, and by Friday it was back in the field finishing the pass it had failed to finish almost 2 weeks earlier. From that point on, Martin did not make a speech about Panhandle Farm Supply. He did not run them down at coffee shops. He did not tell neighbors they were crooks. He did something quieter and more permanent. He stopped needing them. Filters came by mail. Hydraulic fittings came from an industrial supplier east of Sydney. When he needed advice, he called Ray. When he needed a hard part, he asked Kansas first. He made the change privately, but private decisions have a way of multiplying in farm country because farmers compare notes the way accountants compare ledgers. And over the next few seasons, Martin heard the same pattern from other people. One rancher had been told the dealership no longer wanted to fool with a tired 7,700 combine. A beet grower got brushed off when he needed hydraulic work on an older Versatile. Another neighbor brought in a worn haybine and was told, not rudely but plainly, that the shop needed base for newer units. Each story sounded reasonable in isolation. That was the danger. Reasonable, one customer at a time, can still become disastrous when the customers all remember the same lesson. By 1994, the change was visible. The service yard at Panhandle looked less crowded. The parts counter lost its usual line during planting and hay season. A few new machines still moved, but the place no longer felt like the center of anything. It felt like a business waiting for customers who thought of equipment as replaceable and could not understand why the old ones never fully arrived. Glenn Mercer tried promotions. He pushed financing. He offered seasonal service specials. He leaned harder into larger accounts. But the smaller operators, the loyal ones, the people who kept old machines alive because that was what their cash flow demanded and their values respected, had already started building new habits elsewhere. In late 1996, Panhandle Farm Supply was sold. The Ford New Holland sign came down not long after. The building became an irrigation contractor's yard. By spring, the old showroom windows had been papered over from the inside. The place that had once represented continuity now looked like every other shuttered rural property that had mistaken loyalty for convenience. Martin heard about the sale from a seed rep who passed through town. He nodded when the man told him. Then he said, "I wondered how long it would take." That was not revenge speaking. It was arithmetic. A dealership is not just inventory, floor plan financing, and service bays. In places like western Nebraska, it is remembered behavior. It is the promise that when a man buys from you, he is not only buying steel, he is buying future answerability. He is buying the right to believe that when the machine he trusted fails at the worst possible time, the people whose name is on the sign will still speak to him like his problem belongs in the world. Once that feeling disappears, people do not always complain. They just relocate their loyalty. And relocated loyalty is one of the hardest things in business to win back, because it does not move on price first. It moves on memory. Martin kept the TW-35 another 13 years. He used it through wheat, hay, auger work, snow, and the gradual downsizing that comes when a man starts choosing which battles his back still wants. In 2005, he leased out most of his acreage, but kept 40 acres and enough work to stay useful. The Ford remained on the place for the same reason some tools never leave a shop. It had already proven it belonged. It never suffered another major transmission problem. In 2008, his granddaughter Leah, home from community college for the summer, asked whether she could use the Ford to rake alfalfa for a neighbor who had lost help during second cutting. Martin said yes, then spent half a morning walking her through the machine. Clutch feel, throttle habits, hydraulic response, the little pause it liked before dropping into range. By the third day, she came back dusty, sunburned, and smiling in a way Martin recognized immediately. "That tractor's honest," she said. Martin asked her what she meant. "It does exactly what you tell it. Nothing hidden. No nonsense. It just works." He laughed once, softly, because that was almost exactly what he would have said. Leah is 34 now. She and her husband run a mixed grain and hay operation west of Alliance using autosteer, yield maps, guidance screens, and equipment Martin would have considered science fiction in 1975. But the old Ford is still in a machine shed on the family place. It sits not far from a much newer tractor worth several times what Martin paid for the TW-35 in 1984. Leah uses the old machine for auger work, small trailer moves, and the kind of tasks where simplicity is still a competitive advantage. Over the years, she has replaced hoses, redone the seat, put on fresh rear tires, and rebuilt part of the hydraulic stack. The transmission Ray Dolan sourced in 1992 is still there, still quiet, still smooth. Martin told Leah the whole story when he finally handed over the keys, not because he wanted to preserve a grudge, but because he wanted to preserve the lesson. She did. She still remembers the names. She still knows where the call was made, what the local dealership said, and why the machine stayed in the family. Ray Dolan died in 2016. His dealership is still open, run now by his sons. Martin sent a card when he heard the news. He had not known Ray intimately. They had not spent holidays together. They had not been lifelong friends. But Ray had done something larger than a repair. He had recognized value when another man closer by had decided value was no longer convenient. Glenn Mercer also retired years ago. Martin saw him once at the county fair in 1999. They nodded politely and kept moving. There was no argument left to have. The important conversation had taken place 7 years earlier on a telephone line, and every consequence worth measuring had already grown out of it. Martin is 83 now. He does not work the fields the way he once did. But some evenings he still walks into the machine shed and rests a hand on the Ford's fender. The paint is tired. The steps are polished from boots. The cab smells faintly of dust, rubber, and old summers. It is older than many of the operators now driving past the place. It has outlived the dealership that sold it. It has outlived the logic that tried to classify it as not worth the bay space. When Martin looks at it, he does not think first about the breakdown. He thinks about the sentence that came after. Not the failure in the field, the refusal on the phone. He thinks about how quickly trust can be downgraded by someone who mistakes old equipment for low-value people. He thinks about the drive to Kansas, the mechanic who had the assembly ready, the invoice that was clear, the promise that sounded like a promise because it came from a man who still believed service was part of the sale. And he thinks about how strange the final math turned out to be. The tractor stayed. The dealership did not. That is why this story is not really about an old Ford. It is about what happens when a business stops recognizing the memory inside loyalty. It is about the long, almost invisible consequences of telling a customer that his problem no longer fits your future. It is about how one practical decision, delivered in the wrong tone and at the wrong moment, can echo across a community for years. Martin does not tell this story often. He does not need to. The tractor is still there, and so is the proof.